those of us just joining, welcome. We're going to get started here in just a minute. If you want to say hello and let us know where you're joining us from, that's really fun. So far, we've got Alaska, Seattle, Turkey, Australia. It's a really neat mix today. So let us know where you're calling in.
Raleigh, North Carolina.
Oh, Raleigh, we've got some neighbors. How great. All right, well, I'm going to do my best to keep letting everybody in through the waiting room that Zoom has set up for us. As I kind of introduce myself, my name is Virginia. I work here at Broadreach headquarters. We are coming to you live from Raleigh, North Carolina, and we are really excited for our webinar series that we've been working on. Each month, we have a different theme that goes out with our newsletter. And this month's theme was wildlife, animals, really general. And talking at the office, we couldn't help but reach out to one of our favorite podcast hosts. Macken Murphy is with us tonight. He has a really cool podcast that a lot of us have been listening to, especially during these times we're picking up new hobbies and things. You can learn a lot of fun facts from him. And so we are really excited for him to do something with us and do something different. As far as things go tonight, we ask that you keep your mics muted during the presentation. That allows Macken to stay in the speaker view and everyone get the info from him. He is going to share a lot of really cool stuff with us. And then at the end of his talk, there'll be some time for question and answer. So if you have questions that pop up while he speaks, feel free to throw them in the chat. He likely won't respond at that time, but I'll save them and then can share them with him at the end so we can have like a big chunk of questions during question and answer time. And then you'll also have the option, if you see in your chat box, that you have the option to raise your hand. And so he'll also be calling on some people by name that are raising their hand that might want to ask a question verbally. We love to see all your faces. If you want to keep your camera on, that's awesome. It's really neat to see where everyone is and really feel like we're in a room together, but just keep your mics muted. And Macken, I'm going to turn it over to you. We're so excited to have you with us tonight.
Well, I'm excited too. It's a great honor to be here in my apartment. While I'm sorry I can't be speaking to you in person, I'm delighted that I can wear pajama pants without any of you noticing. So when we first learn about evolution by means of natural selection, as many of you are doing right now or have done recently in high school or college, we often make assumptions about nature that ultimately prove untrue. And today, throughout the course of this lecture, I'm going to be tackling 3 of those assumptions. I want to begin, though, with a quick primer on the way evolution works. So the way that evolution by means of natural selection works, because I want to make
Hey, Macken, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I muted you by mistake. Can you go
How
back?
insulting. Oh my gosh.
Oh,
what a scandal.
So sorry.
All right, where were we? When did I stop making noises?
Start over with what evolution really is. Get us in.
Okay. Yeah, that's an important part.
Yeah.
We can't move on without that. So I want to begin with a quick primer on evolution, the way it works. And the way it works is actually quite simple. So first, and let me just make sure that you're not overlapping here on my share. Got a bit of chaos to start the day. Fits the times. So first, animals have different bodies and behaviors. They have different traits. This variation, which is at the base level genetic, is originally produced through a variety of mechanisms that we don't have time to talk about today. Random mutation, recombination, you don't need to worry about the mechanics. Just know that this variation arises naturally. So that's number one. Animals vary. Animals have different bodies, different behaviors. Second, animals have offspring that are like them in body and behavior because their offspring share their genes. Look around the world and you'll notice that people are remarkably different from one another. And yet by the time they grow up, they are far more like their parents than chance would predict. And I apologize because I know there are some teenagers joining us who will be horrified by that information. Third, some animals reproduce, other animals don't. And the ones that have bodies and behaviors better suited to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. So to recap all that, animals have varying traits. Animals make more animals with traits like them, and their varying traits influence their chances to survive and reproduce. And over time, this means that natural selection removes the types of animals who were born with bodies and behaviors that are poorly suited to their environment. Genes that don't work well to help their organisms survive and reproduce eventually stop existing. And over time, this is what causes evolution. Animals who have bodies and behaviors that are well suited to their environment create more animals like them, and the other animals don't have offspring. And so animals like them stop existing, and eventually all that are left are animals that are remarkably well suited to their environment. So that's natural selection. That's all of it. And the first faulty assumption I want to talk about when people first learn about this concept, this first faulty assumption about evolution, is that it's a zero-sum competition. If you win at this game, it means someone else must have lost, right? And this is an understandable assumption when you think about the way evolution works, the way nature works. Some organisms live and reproduce, and the rest die before they get a chance. The winners are the ones whose genes end up in the next generation, and the losers rot. That must mean that nature, either directly or indirectly, must be a fight to the death, right? Sometimes. Sometimes nature is indeed red in tooth and claw. If you look out in the natural world, you'll see murder, you'll see infanticide, you'll see cannibalism. But in the eye of that tornado, you'll also see cooperation so absolute that it borders on absurd. And I want to begin today by showing you some examples of that cooperation and explaining why they're happening. So, because of our assumption that all species are in a perpetual fight to the death, scenes like this look totally absurd. You see this photo and you think someone's got to tell that frog that a massive spider is right behind them, right? But surprise, surprise, that big spider is the frog's bodyguard. This tiny frog lives inside this massive spider's den. They're roommates. And this spider protects him from predators like snakes. For those interested, this is a Colombian lesser black tarantula and a dotted humming frog. Good luck remembering those names. So why does this spider protect this frog? And why does this spider let the frog live inside their nest? Well, the frog, while living in the spider's nest, eats the ants who try to eat the spider's eggs. So think about this. The spider protects the frog, and the frog protects the spider's babies. It's a win-win situation. Remember, natural selection is about survival and reproduction. The spider helps the frog with the first part. The frog helps the spider with the second part. And side note, another thing that's amazing here is that this spider can and does recognize this specific frog. This spider actually eats other frogs, but they protect their frog. There are reports that this spider will sometimes mistake their friend frog for prey, pick them up in their mouth, and then realize, oh my God, I've made a terrible mistake here, and put them back down without eating them. So next up, looking at this still frame, again, you might assume that the moray eel is trying to eat this colorful little shrimp. And this is a decent guess because in other moods, the moray eel is a vicious predator who eats crustaceans much like this. But this species of shrimp is so trusting of the moray eel that they are willing to climb inside this monster's mouth. This shrimp is called a cleaner shrimp, and true to their name, they clean up larger animals. These shrimp will set up cleaning stations with other shrimp, and then they'll all start dancing to try and get the attention of bigger fish. They're literally like high schoolers advertising a car wash fundraiser, right? The bigger fish will pull over, park, get cleaned by these shrimp, and then move on with their day. Now, why would a shrimp be so charitable? And why wouldn't the moray eel just eat them? Well, the moray eel is covered in nasty parasites, but moray eels don't have toothbrushes. Perhaps you've noticed. And so it makes more sense for them to let shrimp take care of it than it does for them to kill and eat them. They don't want to bite the hand that feeds. And the shrimp benefits tremendously because they're eating the parasites they remove. The moray eel is like Uber Eats for them. right? They don't need to waste their time scavenging. They can just set up shop, do a little dancing, and wait for the delivery guy to arrive. Another win-win situation. Both animals help each other's survival here. The shrimp protects the moray eel from costly parasites, and the moray eel provides the shrimp with food on demand. And here's another that is frankly confusing at first sight. This carrion beetle isn't carrying their babies. Those are mites of a totally different species. Those mites are using this beetle like a bus, and the beetle will carry them to food. They're called carrion beetles, not because they like carrying other animals, they do, but because they eat carrion, dead animals. And when they're eating dead animals, their primary competitor for that resource is maggots. And these mites eat the maggots that compete with the beetle for meat. So the beetle picks up all these mites and carries them with him to get food because the mites will take out his competition for the food. This trait is, in action, transport in exchange for taking out competition, but in effect, it ends up being a trade of food for food. Last example. These aphids secrete a sugary liquid known as honeydew, and these ants enjoy eating it off of them. What do aphids get out of this? Well, two things. First, protection. These ants will stop predators like ladybugs from killing their aphid herd. And second, these aphids actually get assistance with reproduction. In some species, these ants will collect aphid eggs and bring them to a sheltered location in their nest where they can develop securely. The ant benefits from eating honeydew, and the aphid gets protection and assistance with reproduction. From a genetic perspective, this is something that's beneficial for both parties. Again, survival and reproduction. The ants help the aphids survive and reproduce, and the aphids help the ants survive. Now, what I've just shown you are 4 examples of symbiosis, specifically mutualism. Mutualism is the specific form of symbiosis where there's an interaction in which both parties benefit. And when I say benefit, I mean both parties are given a better chance of surviving and or reproducing. So the first faulty assumption we had, that animals are in a zero-sum competition at all times, is clearly untrue. Animals work together when it benefits their chances at survival and reproduction. And why do they do this? Because the animals that didn't either didn't live or didn't reproduce. And so their descendants don't exist. Remember, the way evolution works is that some animals survive and reproduce and others don't. That's not necessarily a competitive game. That's a game where you can work together to win. Now let's think. What's the biggest example of symbiosis in the animal kingdom? Everything I've mentioned so far is JV team, right? These are little quirky examples of symbiosis. There's one big one I didn't mention, and it's so big, you probably don't even notice it, even though it's all around you. In terms of biomass, 70% of birds alive today are participating in this form of symbiosis. 60% of non-human mammals are participating in this form of symbiosis. And you're a participant too. And when you consider that humans make up some 36% of biomass for mammals, that means that measuring in mass, 94% of mammals on Earth are active participants in this form of symbiosis. What is it? I'll show you. The suspense isn't intentional here. I struggle to share my screen. It's farming. It's farming. 70% of birds alive today are in places like this. And 60% of non-human mammals are in places like this. Human animal farming is the largest example of symbiosis in the animal kingdom. Now, some people are going to say, this isn't symbiosis, but nobody says that when it's ants and aphids. Swap out honeydew for milk, and this is ants and aphids on a way bigger scale. Survival and reproduction. This relationship, historically, has helped our survival and their reproduction. Both parties evolved in the process. To use this specific example, the cows on the screen, The cows evolved to produce more and more milk. Possibly this was entirely due to artificial selection, but that's a murky area. But the humans certainly evolved. The humans whose ancestors lived in environments with cows evolved the ability to digest milk into adulthood. This isn't something that any other mammal can do. The only mammal that can drink milk in adulthood is the human, and that's because we, to some extent, co-evolved with cows. Now, thanks to this relationship and relationships like it, the number of humans and farm animals on Earth have expanded exponentially. This is an incredibly successful symbiotic relationship. We raise these animals by the billions and ensure their constant reproduction at a staggering rate. And historically, this has been insanely good for both of our evolutionary successes. How do you measure success in an evolutionary sense? Well, it's a hard question. There's no final score tally. There's no ultimate winners. But if you want to keep score by abundance or by territory, farming is a relationship that has been, from an evolutionary perspective, symbiotic. Before humans could farm, the Earth could support maybe 10 million people. After agriculture, we are at over 7 billion, and that number is only going up. And again, from a purely genetic perspective, farm animals are benefiting even more than us. They are more abundant and more widespread than any other vertebrates in the history of the planet, including humans. There are about 1.5 billion cows on Earth, almost 1 billion pigs, and there are 19.6 billion chickens. Even if we didn't count all the other animals we farm, from camels to ducks, they outnumber us 3 to 1. Scientists say that if aliens come to our planet after human extinction, the most enduring evidence of our existence will be the sudden global appearance of uncountable chicken bones in the fossil record. What a legacy, right? It's not that we just started farming 70% of birds and 60% of non-human mammals. It's that because we farm chickens, turkeys, ducks, etc., they became 70% of birds. Because we farm pigs and cows and sheep and camels, they became 60% of mammals. Now, I need you to remember this point for me because I'm about to come back to it. So, here's assumption number 2. What's good for you must be good for your genes. And what's good for your genes must be good for you. Once again, we have a really good reason to make this assumption because usually it is true. Usually, good feelings mean something good is happening for your genetic prospects. Usually, bad feelings mean something bad is happening to your genetic prospects. Evolution invented feelings as a carrot and stick system. The carrot is good feelings, happiness, joy, and pleasure. The stick is bad feelings, misery, pain, depression. Almost everything that is good for your genes feels good. Why does it feel good to eat a nourishing meal? Because you need to eat to survive. Why does it feel good to mate? Because you need to mate to reproduce. Why does it feel good to take care of your kids? Because primates who don't raise their kids don't end up with kids at all. All these things feel good because animals who feel good when they do these things are more likely to do them. And animals who do these things are way more likely to survive and reproduce. Animals who don't enjoy eating will starve. Animals who don't enjoy mating won't leave behind any offspring. Conversely, almost everything that is bad for your genes also feels bad. Why does it feel bad to be hungry or cold or tired? Why does it feel so awful when a relative or an ally dies? Why does it feel bad to get injured? And why is death so scary, right? These feelings are how evolution tells you that this stuff is worth avoiding. Animals who aren't worried about death or injury and don't get uncomfortable when they should, they die. And they are therefore less likely to leave behind offspring. And so that type of animal who doesn't get upset at the right times, that type of animal is less likely to exist. So what we've established here is that the reason good feelings and bad feelings exist in the first place is to incentivize and disincentivize behavior that is good or bad for your genes, good or bad for your evolutionary fitness, your chances at survival and reproduction. However, the overlap isn't perfect. The Venn diagram of what's good for you and what's good for your survival and reproduction is almost a circle, but there's a little bit on the outskirts, and that little bit can do a lot of damage. There are experiences that an animal can have that are good for their genes, but bad for them as an individual. And I'll start with a non-human example. You all probably heard that in many spider species, the females eat the males after they mate. She mates with him, and then she eats him alive. Now, on the list of bad things that can happen to you, getting eaten alive by a spider is probably high on the list. So this spider mates, and in almost the exact same moment, dies. In the same few minutes that he ensures his genes' place in the next generation, he gets eaten alive. So think about this. This means that the best day of this spider's life for his genes is also the worst day of his life for himself as an individual. Nature doesn't care whether or not you have a quote unquote good life or bad life. It cares whether or not you create life. Evolution doesn't make happy animals. It makes more animals, and it makes them however happy or unhappy is facultative to their survival. And here I want to return to this example of symbiosis. And once again, you guys are going to be treated to some suspense. This example of symbiosis, I don't know what goes on in an aphid's brain, but they do have brains, and they almost certainly have experiences. And the experience of these little aphids here maybe aren't so good compared to the ones who don't live with ants. The ants cut off these aphids' wings so they can't fly away, so they can trap them to farm them. The ants cover them in chemicals that drug them and make them sluggish and tranquil so they can be easier to control. And sometimes these ants slaughter and eat the aphids. This is an experience, a life that is good for their genes. This is good for the aphids' chances of reproduction and survival, but it's maybe not good for them as individuals. Now, granted, maybe we aren't sure what the aphids are feeling here, right? It's hard to know what's going on in the little mind of an aphid, but we can be pretty sure about what these animals are feeling, right? This is not a good life. In fact, as far as being an animal goes, this is about as bad as it gets. I'll spare you the details, but just trust me, these animals live worse lives than almost any others that have ever existed. And yet at the same time, at least so far, this is as good for their genes as it could get. Copies of their genes exist by the billions all over the world. They're among the most biologically successful vertebrates in history. Our relationship with these animals is mutualistic on a genetic level, and yet it is simultaneously parasitic on a personal level. And this brings me to the final wrong assumption, that evolution can look around corners. People assume that evolution prepares an organism for the future, but unfortunately, it prepares them only for the past. How does evolution work? Natural selection, right? Some individuals survive and reproduce and create more individuals like them, and the other individuals fail to do this, and so individuals like them stop existing. This means that what you see around you today are evolution solutions to yesterday's problems. Now, happily, the Earth is a relatively stable place, and so usually tomorrow's problems are the same as yesterday's. But evolution can't always prepare organisms for what's around the corner. Evolution can't make predictions, and evolution hates surprises. If natural selection prepared animals for the future, the dinosaurs would have been a little better prepared to deal with high impacts. Farm animals, though they are abundant now, are going to go the way of the dinosaur. All species will, given enough time, but these ones, these farm animals, are probably going to go extinct relatively soon. in all likelihood, people are eventually going to stop farming animals. Why? Well, first, the practice of animal farming is unsustainable. It takes up over a third of the planet's habitable land, and according to the UN, it produces almost as much emissions as all planes, trains, and automobiles combined. And it's making some governments start to crack down on it already. China is explicitly trying to cut meat consumption in their country by 50% within the decade. Second, of course, there's the cruelty and slaughter involved. And as people become more and more morally conscientious, less and less people want to pay for animals to get tortured and killed, right? And third, meat and dairy and egg alternatives are getting so good that very soon there will be literally no difference. According to those who should know what they're talking about, within the next decade, we'll see commercially available lab-grown meat that is, in every meaningful way, indistinguishable from the real thing. And given the costs, when that happens, how many people are really going to want to keep eating dead animals? So if we stop eating these animals and their secretions, we'll stop breeding them. And if we stop breeding them, they won't exist. Now, given how difficult their lives are, this is almost inarguably a good thing, but it's not good for their genes. I'm not saying this will happen tomorrow, but given all the reasons for humans to give up this practice and given all the developments in technology that are coming, how long do you think we'll be doing this? 100 more years? 200 more years? Are humans going to be doing this on Mars? Does anyone think this will survive 1,000 more years? 1,000 years might seem like a really long time, but the average species exists for about 5 to 10 million years. These animals only evolved through artificial selection about 10,000 years ago. So compare that, 10,000 years down, about 5 million to go. Does anyone really think that this practice has another 10,000 years, let alone a million? We're going to be doing this for a million years, 5 to 10 million? No. These animals have been part of this crazy symbiotic experiment that short term has been great for their genes, but bad for them personally. And it may end up being the worst thing that could happen to their genes too. This experiment likely ends in their extinction. It's possibly true that humans will leave a legacy of chicken bones in the fossil record, but it will likely be a very thin layer indeed. What's good for your genes isn't necessarily good for you. And what's good for your genes today might not be good for them tomorrow. Evolution by means of natural selection is a marvelous tool. It is impossible to overstate how amazing it is that the simple process of removing unsuccessful organisms and replicating successful ones can lead to beings like us. For the most part, evolution has done a wonderful job taking care of all of us. It's the reason most of us can expect to live relatively healthy lives with well-functioning brains and bodies. It's and joy exist. It's why we get to enjoy the taste of food. It's why we get to enjoy falling in love. It's why you exist. Evolution is what brought our wonderful cooperative instincts into existence. It is, in multiple ways, the reason that I got to team up with Broadreach tonight. But evolution is not perfect. It doesn't care whether or not we live good lives on balance, and it doesn't know what's coming around the corner. Thank you.
Thanks, Macken. That was awesome. I'm thinking about lots of things right now, and I know that our group probably is too. I didn't have any questions come through during the conversation, so I would love to see some people's questions come in, whether it's about symbiotic relationships, parasitic relationships, how long these relationships last, and hopefully Macken can give us some insight. What is everybody thinking about? What are you all curious now that you've heard a little more? You can raise your hand and Macken can call on you, or if you want to, you can go ahead and throw it in the chat, whatever's easier. Looks like Cassie might have a question.
Yeah, hi. My question is, Macken, do you know why other mammals can't digest milk?
So to be clear, other mammals, good question. So other mammals, they can digest milk in infancy, right? So what milk is something that female mammals produce in order to feed their young during the first years of their life. Because obviously in mammals, the infants aren't particularly well able to fend for themselves. But just like we wean our children off of our milk, other mammals wean their children off of their milk. And so there's no facultative reason, right? Like you won't see a chimpanzee walking up to a cow and trying to milk them, right? That's not something that happens. And so there's been no selection pressure for the ability to digest lactose. And so you probably know many people who are lactose intolerant, right? And the number one predictor of whether or not you are lactose tolerant or lactose intolerant is whether you come from an area where your ancestors took advantage of cows, right? So I'm Irish, right? And Irish people actually have the highest lactose tolerance of any group on earth because Irish people had a lot of cows for a really long time and they were a small population. So you can get that selection going quite quickly. And it can spread through, an advantageous gene can spread through quite quickly. But that hasn't happened to the chimps. It hasn't happened to the armadillos. And as a result, no other mammals can do it. But that's a good question. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
We also have a question from Ezra and Ronan. Go ahead, y'all.
Oh, yeah. So, okay, my question is, so you were talking a lot about how, like, with farming, we're doing good for cows and what other animals that we farm commonly. Yeah, from a genetic perspective, but like they just don't live very happy lives. But yeah, like to you, what do you think is more important? Like if you were looking through the eyes of a cow or some commonly farmed mammal or any animal at all.
That is an excellent question. And that is, I mean, this is something that I actually run into a lot. So why do we care about conservation, right? Why does it make us sad to hear that the panda bears might go extinct, right? It's for the sake of the panda bears. And so it's for the sake of the individuals involved there. I mean, I'm sure for some people it's just, well, panda bears are really beautiful and I'd like to look at them for the rest of my life. But look, we've got pictures, we've got videos. It's for most people, it's like we're worried about the pandas themselves. And so if all the panda bears were living just the worst lives, like if they weren't having these kind of blissful existences, competing for abundant bamboo, if they were living in kind of a torture scape, then we probably wouldn't be like, oh my God, we really got to keep the pandas going. We'd probably breathe a sigh of relief. So I think that we can kind of apply the same logic there to cows. I mean, I like to think, would I rather be a cow in a modern environment or not? And the answer is, if I woke up tomorrow as a dairy cow, I would hope that I didn't wake up the next morning. So I would say the genes aren't particularly important, but the experiences. But thank you for that question.
Yeah, I agree too. Thanks for the thanks for the answer.
Thanks for the great question.
How about the Levy or Levi family? Sorry, I don't know how to pronounce that.
That's good. Levy's fine. Hey, thanks for that excellent lecture, Macken, as always. I kind of interested in what you were saying about the chicken bones, and I'm wondering why exactly you think that the chicken species would die out altogether. Have we bred them to the point that they could not survive in a non-domesticated fashion, and would that truly lead to their complete extinction? Or if suddenly humans disappeared, isn't it possible that they might roam free like they do on some islands in Hawaii?
Yeah, so that is a very good question. And so I guess one thing that I should have explained better is that. So one thing that is hard to understand, but is unfortunately true, is that you need so many samples over such a long period of time for fossilization to even happen. It's such a low odds game. I don't know if this is true, but I was speaking to someone who knows more than I do on this topic, and they were saying that if humans went extinct today, because we've only been around for 2 million years, like that's like the highest you can get. He said there wouldn't be a single complete skeleton, right? Like it would be just, there's, even though there's so many humans right now, hasn't been long enough, and you need really specific, like most of our like human evolution skeletons come from these like crazy freak accidents where someone fell into a cave, and then was immediately buried by sand, and then a wave came in and it was just all worked out perfectly. It's so that's kind of part one. So even if chickens persist, I mean, so there's the domesticated chicken species, and then there's wild chicken species. And the wild chicken, we're really closely related to the domestic chicken, they're going to survive for however long they do, maybe 5 to 10 million years. Will they leave fossils? Maybe, maybe not. There's not that many of them. They're only in Southeast Asia. And then for domesticated chickens, some of them will survive, but the ones that we see survive for decades and maybe even centuries now in feral populations, they're very lucky. They are on islands where there aren't, because I mean, foxes would, any properly suited predator. I mean, we've designed these chickens to be easy to catch and kill, and we've designed them to taste good and be covered in meat. So if you put them among the lions, if you put them among the wolves, they will disappear very quickly. But you're right that some would probably persist. I would say that if we stopped farming today, none of us would see the extinction of pigs. Like there are feral pigs in all over the place. Like none of us would see these things, but give it 1,000 years, they'll be gone. But great question. Thank you.
Looks like we had a question come in from Abby on the chat that says, if we don't need cows and chickens, I'm guessing this shifts the success to plant species like fungi, etc., trading one thing for another. And that feels like part of natural selection too. So what are your thoughts on that?
This is a complex, that's a good question. And I think you're right. I mean, one thing that, so here's one thing that's very counterintuitive, is that if we stopped farming animals, it would be bad for the genetics of the plants we farm too. Something that we don't think about, but if we all started eating exclusively plants, we would start growing less plants than ever. And the reason is because animals eat plants, and the animals that we grow eat plants that we grow. And so we have to grow way more than we would have to otherwise. So I would say that it wouldn't necessarily shift the balance in the genetic balance in terms of plant species, right? Like the worst thing that could happen to corn right now, well, there are a few worse things, but one of the worst things that could happen is that we stopped feeding it to livestock. So corn would take a hit, but it would shift. We would be using so much less land that the genetic balance would tilt wild, right? So you'd have like half of our land is being used for farming, 70% of that for animal farming. So reduce our farming land by 70%. That's 30-something% of the world that's not being used anymore. And animals fill niches quickly. Wild animals would take that up. You'd see a lot of wild animals taking that shift. But it's a good question, and I think it's mostly correct because plants would be the first in.
We'll see a couple more questions come in. If you've got one, raise your hand, throw it in the chat. But I do know that some people might start popping out too. So that everybody that is here, I'm going to put a feedback survey in the chat for you all. Would love to know what your favorite thing that you learned tonight was, and also how you heard about tonight's conversation. So I'm going to throw that in the chat, and then we'll get back to those questions. Give me just 1 second there. Looks
Thanks.
like Spencer has a question.
Yes, I was just about to point that out.
Awesome.
2 hands raised.
Big fans of the podcast here.
Like, do the aphids fly to the ants' nest on purpose when they, or like, do the ants capture the aphids?
That is an excellent question. I'm glad to hear you're fans of the show. So look, there's a bunch of different species that do this. There's a bunch of different, I mean, it seems like such a crazy relationship. You'd think, okay, there's no way this happened twice. It's like, no, it's happened many, many times where ants and aphids have formed mutualistic relationships. And so in each one, it's going to be very different. You have species where there are ants who, for example, farm root aphids. So the entirety of what I explained, it's all happening underground, right? And the ants will build an underground chamber. The aphids will take advantage of that chamber because they have access to all these roots that are penetrating the chamber. And so they've now got this great place to subsist. And so that's very natural. But there are cases where ants just hijack a wild group of, like aphids are kind of hanging out. The ants have in some species, and I spoke about this, they have chemicals on the bottom of their feet that have evolved to subdue and tranquilize aphids. And so they can land on this group of aphids, start tranquilizing them, start ripping off those wings, and then the aphids are trapped. And they wait for some eggs. There are species, for example, where, how do they keep this going, right? Do they have to hijack new groups every time? There are species where they take the eggs from the aphid, and during the winter time, when the aphids might normally go do other activities, they take these eggs and they bring them down into tunnels and build places to stabilize them, and then wait for the next season and hatch the eggs. So it's very involved. And then when new queens want to start colonies, they'll pick up eggs and they'll carry them to new places. And so sometimes you'll have entire lineages of aphids that belong to one lineage of ants. It's crazy stuff. So I don't think there's any, I mean, look, I'm not an entomologist. This is not my area of expertise. There's someone you could ask who would be able to give you a better answer. But to my knowledge, there is no group of aphids that seeks out the ants. And I think that the reason for that is just because the ants are seeking them out with great enthusiasm. I'm sure that honeydew tastes very nice. So thanks for the question. That was a great one. Sorry I took a minute to notice you.
Awesome. Ezra and Ronan, you guys have another?
Yeah, so previous question stated that you stated that chickens would probably go extinct because we genetically modified them to become more appetizing because it tastes better. But I mean, do you think that even with the enormous populations of cows, pigs, chickens, the 3 most farmed animals, do you think they'd really go extinct even with such high population, and with how chickens lay eggs very quickly because of how we created them? Do you think how long would it take for them to go extinct?
Again, I wouldn't be able to give a very good estimate. I answered a similar question earlier, and I think that there's 2 real factors here. The first is that these animals are basically useless in terms of their ability to defend themselves, their ability to survive. Domestication, one thing that it's done is it's reduced their aggression and it's reduced their fear response. You can walk right up to a cow and they're just going to chill out. Try the same thing with a deer. It won't go well, right? The deer are considered friendly animals. They will get vicious if you get close. Brother nature excluded. So there's that. And then there's the fact that these animals are really not designed to reproduce independently and live a long time. So a lot of these animals they reproduce manually with human help. And frankly, so you said the example with chickens, them laying a lot of eggs, that would actually be detrimental to their reproductive rate. So chickens in the wild, they lay eggs very infrequently. These animals, they lay eggs dozens of times a day. That sounds better. It sounds a lot better, but it's not better because they lose so much calcium laying eggs. They lose so much calcium through that actually their legs often break underneath them because their bones lose. So they're so top heavy. They're losing so much calcium through laying eggs that eventually, if you go onto a chicken farm, you'll find lots of them with leg fractures. And in the wild, there's no, you can't go into the vet and get a splint for that. That's just game over. So I don't know how long it would take. I have no idea. But I would be fairly certain that they wouldn't be able to roll back the clock quick enough in the face of the selection pressures that they are hit with. It's possible that, like we see that feral pigs can be very successful. I could imagine them surviving, but I think that, look, there are animals occupying the niches that chickens would occupy, that would be so much better than them. They wouldn't be able to compete. So I would say that even with the staggering numbers, it would, and also the way that this would happen, it would be very slow. I don't think it would be like the world moves on to lab grown meat and all the doors are open. I think it would be like a very slow transition where it's like hipsters are eating real meat, and it's like a weird thing that you can do in Brooklyn. And then eventually it's gone. So that would be my prediction. But again, another good question from you. So thank you.
Thanks. Yeah.
Awesome. I've got another question from Violet. How does the survival of one's community obstruct the success of the overall species? For example, human war putting individual success above general human success, and similar fighting within other species.
Violet, excellent question, and I think you answered it. It often is bad, and this is another assumption that I could have talked about. Was my lecture longer? Is that we assume that evolution is good for the numbers of a species that exist. Oftentimes, it's really bad. Like if you can look up simulations of, and I actually recommend you do this. You can look up people who have used AI programs to simulate different traits in an evolutionary biology context. And there are some things that are oftentimes inefficient, aggressive, brutish traits. Those actually lead to less animals existing. Like if we wanted if evolution worked to make the most numbers of a species, to just inflate the numbers, then almost all animals would be like ants, but except all of them cooperating instead of groups competing against each other. So yeah, I mean, individual success can obstruct group success. It's one of the main obstacles to cooperation emerging in the first place. And group success, I think you put the best example with warfare. Group success can really mess with species success. And I mean, we could keep going with this. Species success messes with the success of life on Earth, as we see with humans. Great question. Oh, and there's another one. I can actually read this one. Also enjoy. So this is from Aspen. And I'll read it aloud just so everyone knows what's being asked. I'm interested in hearing your thoughts, knowing what farming plants is economically and ecologically more efficient today than farming animals. Do you think it's possible that humans could have ever have reached a similar level of development and social organization without farming animals? How inextricable is farming animals as opposed to farming generally? This is an excellent question. So they're asking, what's the difference between basically how important was farming animals versus farming plants? Could we have done what we did without farming plants? And I'm going to say, I don't know. Again, like you can't go back and run it again. But I will say this. I'll say that meat was very important in our evolutionary history. Eating meat was very important in our evolutionary history. And in some places, drinking milk was very important. Like milk was a really potent survival technology. I mean, think about the efficiency of milk. If you're living in a really northern climate, this is something where it turns grass into protein. Right. Like that's That's free food. That's as free as it gets. Now, nowadays we can grow corn up north, right? Like we have mastered plant farming to the point where anywhere that humans can live, almost our corn can live too. And anywhere that it can't live, look, we can get it there, right? Like we can go to the moon, we can definitely transport it. So yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I wish I was a true expert on this topic, so I could answer it, but I don't know. I have no way to make that prediction. I would say it's pretty important, and now we can move on. But back then, I don't think it would have worked out.
We have another question from Madeline. Madeline, you want to unmute?
So you said the first picture you showed was about the spider and the frog. How does the spider know when they pick up the frog in its mouth? How does it know it's this frog they're protecting?
So that is a very good question. So normally they would know. Thank you, Madeline. So normally they might know because they'd be like, "Hey, this is my roommate, right? I go home. There's a frog in here. That's my friend. I don't attack him." But sometimes the frog has business to attend to too, and they're both out and about. And the spider is like, "Okay, here's my meal." Lunge at the frog, pick them up. How do they realize it? Right. Well, here's what scientists think, because I had the same question as you. They think that the frog secretes a chemical signal, a taste, that they can recognize. Now, this may seem very last minute to you and I. I think we'd all hate to be, I don't know, trying to take a bite out of our own dog, for example, and being like, "Oh my God, sorry, Rex. I only realized it was you when I tasted you." But that is how it works with these spiders, or at least that's how they think it works. I don't know if anyone's actually run the experiment there, but what we do know is we've seen this spider pick up their own frog, and the humans can see it's their own frog, and they've dropped it almost apologetically, like, "Hey, whoa, made a mistake here." Good question.
Thank you.
We have about 5 more minutes for more questions with Macken. Macken, I have a question, which, since I know we have lots of podcast listeners, if you're willing to answer, what got you started in the species world? Because you're not an entomologist and you're not a farmer. So like, what got you into this animal fact life that you're now an expert in?
Yeah, no, I mean, I wouldn't call myself an expert, but definitely what got me into it was, well, gosh, I mean, it's a really long question. I mean, it's hard to believe now, but there was a time in my life where I really wanted to become a professional boxer, right? I was boxing on the local circuit. I was obsessed with fighting all the time. And you know, like I had the most modest of successes. Like I won the New England Junior Olympics. I got second in the local Golden Gloves. Like I was really into it, but I wasn't good enough to go pro. And so this quest became kind of increasingly quixotic as my life went on. Certainly, like I was halfway through college and I was still trying to make this thing happen. And it was like, okay, like eventually I realized this is not going to work out. And so, I mean, look, I had an interest in animals dating back to my childhood, and I loved podcasts. I listened to every night. I listened to a podcast to go to sleep. So I was familiar with the medium. And I was so depressed after quitting boxing that I was like, okay, I got to do something really time consuming to get me back to feeling normal. And so, I mean, this is what I chose, and it's look, I mean, it's so much fun. And I'm sure my brain cells are grateful for the change of pace. I'm laughing at the workout tutorial I'm getting from one of the guests. I think I see another question from Spencer Ops. Is that the title?
Well, I have two questions.
Go for it.
Is it like all is there like all types of frogs that are like, do the spiders just have one type of frog, or can they go, or do they like, do the spiders use, for example, would a spider use a poison dart frog to protect his kid?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. And you know, I'm actually going to give you kind of the reverse answer. So I think there's only one type of frog that does this, but so the people who talk about arachnids argue about this, right? So I said it was the Colombian lesser black tarantula who's involved with this. Some of the arachnid experts, I don't even know what the name for an arachnid expert is, but I know that they get upset about it because they write blog posts like, hey, it's not this type of spider, it's this type of spider. And then there are other ones who, so I've never heard of another type of frog that does this. There may well be. I'm not an expert on amphibians, but there are almost certainly other types of spiders that do this. And some people think it's the case that it's one type of spider getting confused for multiple types of tarantula. But it's a really crazy relationship, but I think it's simple enough that if you had a frog that was really game and like evolved to do it, they could port that over to working with a new spider. Although I'm sure that the trial runs would not be so successful. But yeah, good question. So my answer, maybe there are other frogs. I'm not sure. I think based on my reading of the literature, there are multiple types of spiders that do this one type of frog, taking advantage of all of them.
My second question is like, do all types of frogs use that like the same taste? Like, for example, like say you had a spider using a different frog, would that same frog use the same, like would they use identical chemicals, or would they like the frogs without spiders, would they have chemicals too to trick the spiders?
Yeah, that is a very good question, because what you're getting at there is you're getting at the idea of mimicry, because they could a frog, like the best thing a frog could do if they're living in that area is put on the perfume that tricks the spiders. But no, so I don't think the experiment's been done. You would need to do an experiment testing whether or not the frog can be differentiated within the species. I'm certain that across species, the spider isn't that the spider would know. So I'm not sure. It could be that that all frogs of the same species are wearing the same perfume and tricking all the spiders. But I think that from what I've read, it's and again, there's going to be someone who knows more about this, but I think from what I've read that it is a chemical signature that is individual to the frog, which the tarantula can recognize somehow through living with them. Through occasionally taking a sniff. I don't know. But thank you. Good questions. Very good questions.
We have another one, Cassie. And then after that, we'll get to Kiara. So Cassie first.
Yeah, thanks. So my question is like, well, you asked before, like, how long did you think it would take for like meat eating to go out by now? I think it'll take about 50 years. But at that point, like, well, hopefully less than 50 years, but at that point, do you think like other like usings for animals too will go out? Like I personally own eight chickens and 3 ducks backyard. Like I ride horses and I have dogs. Do you think like that sort of thing will also go like out of style and will happen a lot less?
Yes, that's a very good question. I don't know. There's not, look, the pressure is way less on those industries, right? Like it's simply not like China isn't trying to cut meat production by 50%, because they're worried about animal cruelty. Like, that's not the concern there. The concern is ecological, and we simply don't have the same ecological concerns with dogs, with horses and things like that. So you won't get the state pressure coming down, and you also won't get the alternatives. It's true that lab-grown meat is going to be, it's going to be indistinguishable. Like, you won't be able to tell taste test wise. It'll be completely impossible. And so it's going to be really hard to make the argument like, no, I want the dead one, right? Like that's going to be a weird thing to make, but that won't be true of dogs. Maybe there'll be a kind of a robot companion, but I don't know if people will like that. So I don't know what's going to happen there. Time will tell, but it's a really good question. And I appreciate the optimistic 50 years.
Cool. Kiara, what are you wondering?
Hi. So you probably had a lot of questions about the ants and the spiders. I mean, the frogs and the spiders. But do you know if the spiders have multiple frog companions, or is it just one special frog that they get?
I don't know. I think, I've never seen a picture. So again, I'm glad that I'm getting so many questions on this topic. I would have beefed up my literature review before coming in here had I known. But look, from my light research, I've seen this as a one frog, one spider relationship, a monogamous friendship. I don't think, but it would be hilarious if you could walk in on a spider just surrounded by frog pets that are taking out the ants. But I don't think that's happening. But I also don't see why it wouldn't happen. Yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is that with any of these things, like, we talk about these relationships like they're very static, and oftentimes they turn out not to be. I was just reading the other day, like, people thought ospreys were monogamous for ages, but occasionally ospreys can live with one female and multiple males, and occasionally the other way around. So you can have relationships that just kind of sprout out. And look, I mean, just imagining it, I don't see why a spider would be like, okay, I'm a one frog spider, get out of here. It's entirely possible that two frogs could sneak in there, but that's a good question. I don't know.
Thank you.
Also, Emily, I'm glad to hear it.
Caleb asks, what would you say is the primary reason for the success of the human species? Evolution seems like such a chaotic process. What makes us so special?
Gosh, I mean, if I had the answer to that, I would write a book and make a bunch of money, but I don't know. And it's something that if you walk into an anthropology department, you're going to get to overhear many arguments about this. I think that there was really a series of adaptations that led to our preeminence. I think that Sapiens is a good book to kind of introduce you to that series of adaptations. But from my perspective, the most consequential was probably the domestication of fire, in terms of what that is. One behavior that, look, I mean, other people point to other behaviors and have historically, like tool use, like hunting, or hunting in packs, or monogamy, right? Like, these are all things that people point to and they say, okay, this is what makes humans special. But those things are all over the animal kingdom, and the other animals aren't doing the things that we're doing. So if you're gonna say, all right, I want to get one trait, like, it's probably lots of traits, but if what you want is one trait, you need to narrow that list down and knock off everything that other animals have. And what remains is a very short list. And the most interesting in that list is cooking, the domestication of fire, because the domestication of fire allowed for cooking, and cooking allowed us to externalize our digestion. So we could spend less time gathering resources, and we could spend less time digesting it. It meant that our digestive system got physically smaller and less costly. And if you look at it Richard Wrangham has a great book on this, Catching Fire. You look at it on a graph, and it's like our nutritional requirements are the same as chimpanzees, but they spend a lot of energy on guts and we spend a lot of energy on brains. And I think the best idea is that fire saved us that space on guts, and all the social pressures, the ecological pressures that incentivize intelligence, suddenly they're on sale, right? Suddenly we can afford those things. And that's how it went. So that's what I think. But if you're looking for one trait, but again, even saying that, that there's plenty of people who are going to disagree there, and they'll have very good reasons for disagreeing. So I'm not committed to that answer, but.
Awesome. I hate to like cut anybody off, but we are like a little bit over time, and I want to be respectful of that for everybody. So I'm going to throw that feedback link in the chat again, and there is a section there. None of the questions are required. There's a section there that you can put your extra questions, burning things that you're still thinking about, and we'll do our best to answer those when we post it up on the Broadreach blog. This is recorded, so you can visit it anytime. And I'm sure Macken will be able to share it out as well. So keep an update for that. We are so glad to be here tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. Macken, thank you so much for agreeing to partner up with us tonight. This is such a treat.
Yeah, it was a great. Can I get one more question? Do you mind if I take
go for it? One more. Let's do it.
Here we go. I see this kid raising their hand very eagerly. Everyone, feel no pressure to stay. Thank you so much. It's been such a great evening, and it's such a delight to talk to all of you. Thank you, Broadreach. This is a really fun opportunity. Never done anything like it. Consider this the end of the show. If you want to leave, I won't be hurt. But I am going to take one more question. So.
Can you make a zebra podcast?
Perfect last question. Yes, I'll make a zebra podcast. I'll add them to the list.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you for coming. Thanks, everybody.